Back at it again with the Mobius Dickus, chapter 99, The Doubloon. So this is a pretty classic chapter which deals with some of the central issues of the text, namely the subjectivity of interpretation, knowledge, and meaning, which are ideas that we've been tracking ever since chapters 36 and 42, as well as before. And of course, the central conceit of the chapter is that Ahab, Starbuck, Stubb, Flask, Manxman, Queequeg, Fedallah, and Pip all offer differing interpretations of what this piece of gold that Ahab has nailed to a mast for the reward for the person who spots and captures Moby Dick means. What does it mean? So the first interpretation is from Ahab, and he says, there's something ever egotistical in mountaintops and towers and all other grand and lofty things. Look here, 3 peaks as proud as Lucifer. And that is Ahab. That firm tower is Ahab. The volcano, that is Ahab. The courageous, the undaunted, victorious fowl, that too is Ahab. All are Ahab. This round gold is but the image of the rounder globe, which like a magician's glass to each and every man in turn, but mirrors back his own mysterious self. Great pains, small gains for those who ask the world to solve them, it cannot solve itself. Methinks now this coined sun wears a ruddy face, but see, he enters the sign of storms, the equinox, and but 6 months before he wheeled out from a former equinox at Aries, from storm to storm. So be it then. Born in throes, it is fit that man should live in pain and die in paying. So be it then. Here's stout stuff for woe to work on. So be it then. Okay, so Ahab imagines the doubloon and its mountains and towers to be representations of himself. And he sees himself as striving, like those towers, to reach the high heights of knowledge that one might say are permitted from being accessible to human beings. He wants to go into the sign of storms, the equinox. He wants to live from storm to storm and find out what is at the top of those mountains. And he says that great pains and small gains for those who ask the world to solve them, it cannot solve itself. So he seems to position himself in that position of the solver. I need to climb those mountains to find out what the world is all about. We can contrast this with Starbuck, who, seeing the same coin, sees a dark valley between 3 mighty heaven-abiding peaks that almost seem the Trinity in some faint earthly symbol. So in this veil of death, God girds us round, and over all our gloom, the sun of righteousness still shines a beacon and a hope. So obviously a very different interpretation of Ahab. Whereas Ahab wants to be the mountains and to be the peaks, Starbuck sees those peaks as being God, and he sees himself down in the valley of death, but protected by the heaven-abiding peaks of righteousness. If we bend down our eyes, the dark veil shows her moldy soil, but if we lift them up to the peaks, the bright sun meets our glance halfway to cheer. Yet, the great sun is no fixture, and if at midnight we would fain snatch some sweet solace from him, we gaze for him in vain. This coin speaks wisely, mildly, truly, but still sadly to me. I will quit it, lest truth shake me falsely. So Starbuck has a little bit of a tragic view, which is the mountains are there, the presence of God is there, but it's also easy to get lost in the darkness of the valley of death. So he doesn't want to be reminded of that possibility of being lost. He wants to focus when those mountains are in the light. Okay, so now we move to a different interpretation, which is Stubb, who sees the same coin and says, pity if there is nothing wonderful in signs and significant in wonders. There's a clue somewhere. Wait a bit. Hark, hark. By Jove, I'll have it. Look, you doubloon, your zodiac here is the life of man in one round chapter. Now I'll read it off, straight out of the book. Come, almanac, to begin. So then Stubb goes into this long tirade about how he sees all 12 signs of the zodiac in the doubloon and how that mirrors the cycle of life for man. I'm not particularly interested in what your boy Stubb thinks. I'm interested that it's different than the people who have come before him and clearly based on a different mode of interpretation or knowledge. This is followed by Flask, who of course in his flasky way says, I see nothing here but a round thing made of gold, and whoever raises a certain whale, this round thing belongs to him. So what's all this staring been about? It is worth $16, that's true, and 2 cents the cigar, that's 960 cigars, right? So Flask is the pure, non-metaphysical, practical, physical interpretation of the world. It has no deeper meaning. Moby Dick is just a whale. It's just an animal, okay? again, a different interpretation of the world and its possible meanings. Manxman, who is the ex-hearse driver, apparently, says, if the white whale be raised, it must be in a month or a day, or when the sun stands in some of these signs. I've studied signs and know their marks, and they were taught to me 20 years ago by the old witch in Copenhagen. So apparently his method of interpretation is sun interpretation and placement of the sun as a kind of black magic, not black magic, but, like odd, ritualistic, old interpretation from, it even says, a witch who taught him. Then we have Queequeg, who, according to the narrator, says the cannibal is looking for signs in the doubloon, and then he ultimately sees like comparisons to the tattoos on his legs, and ultimately he concludes that it doesn't have much meaning. Just like Flask, he doesn't know what to make of the doubloon. He takes it for an old button off of some king's trousers, right? And then we have Fadala. What does Fadala think? His tail coiled out of sight as usual. Again, remember, they think Fadala is some kind of weird devil. Oakum in the toes of his pumps as usual. What does he say? What that look of his? Makes a sign to the sign and bows himself. There's a sun on the coin. Fire worshipper. Depend upon it. So perhaps Fadala thinks that the doubloon is full of meaning because his method of interpretation is based on worshipping fire. And then, of course, we have Pip. Poor Pip, who has been, obviously, since chapter 93, changed by his encounter with the solitude of being lost in the ocean. And he comes up to the doubloon, and the narrator makes a joke that he's been studying his grammar, because he says, I look, you look, he looks, we look, ye look, they look. So obviously the literal meaning here is that Pip, is gone crazy and he's just repeating this sentence. But of course, any reader who's paying attention figuratively can point out that the choice of the verb look is very intentional, as well as the multiple subjects, because this entire chapter is about how different people look, i.e. use their sight, figuratively understanding, to understand the world in vastly different ways. So even though we are all doing the same verb of looking, that looking is always different based on how people see or understand the world. And as this chapter seems to demonstrate, that sight or understanding of the world seems pretty darn subjective. Okay? And so, finally, the last passage I want to talk about down here. Here's the ship's navel, this doubloon here. The navel being like the center of life, right? That's where the umbilical cord comes off. It's the navel has been used since time immemorial to represent the center, the beginning. This doubloon here, and they are all one fire to unscrew it. But unscrew your navel, and what's the consequence? Then again, if it stays here, that is ugly too, for when aught's nailed to the mast, it's a sign that things grow desperate. So you've got two bad choices according to this chapter. You can take the doubloon off, but the doubloon, the problem of interpretation, i.e. you can stop trying to interpret things, right? Just remove the doubloon and don't have people look at it. But what's the consequence of that? Well, I guess you just lose your ability to understand the world, and you kind of wander around blind to what the world might be about. But then again, if it stays here, that's ugly too, because we haven't come any closer to necessarily finding a true answer to the interpretation of the doubloon. We've just got a plurality of competing and contradictory interpretations in this chapter. So pick your poison according to this chapter when it comes to knowledge and interpretation, and perhaps according to this book. However you're going to interpret something, someone's going to disagree with you, just like chapter 36 and 42 contradict each other. And ultimately, your task as a person is to decide what method of interpretation makes sense to you and to live with that. And this chapter certainly doesn't pull its punches in pointing out how difficult and fraught that epistemic task will be for anyone who is willing to try to read the doubloon. All right. Thanks for paying attention to this chapter, and I'll see you in the next one.